Open up your Bibles to Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Ecclesiastes chapter 8. We know here King Solomon he's continuing his investigation, looking at the value of wisdom, and he comes to a problem that he's having to face, the evil in the world, and it's a problem that no honestly thinking person could really avoid. And it is not unbelief that creates the problem, but faith. If there is no God, then we have nobody to blame but ourselves, or fate, if you want to, for what happens in the world. And a lot of people ask that question, why does God allow suffering in this world or difficulties in the world? Does God know about it, and yet does he not care? Or does he know and care, but does he lack the power to do anything about it? And Solomon doesn't deny the existence of God or the reality of evil, nor does he limit the power of God, but he solves the problem of evil in the world by affirming some factors and seeing them in their proper perspective, putting all the pieces together. And so we need to not forget that one major source of evil in this world has fallen us, man, and our many devices, both good and evil, that we've helped create the problems that we have at hand. God certainly cannot be blamed for these things. One person asked during World War II, why doesn't God stop the war? And a wise man replied, because he didn't start the war in the first place. And so he explores these thoughts in verses 1 through 9. He starts with this idea on authority. We're not going to go through all of it, but I just want us to look at these first 9 verses. So here in verses 1 through 9, he writes in verse 1, who is like the wise man, and who knows the interpretation of a matter? A man's wisdom illumes him and causes his stern face to beam. I say, keep the command of the king because of the oath before God. Because of the oath before God. You know, in Genesis chapter 10, and looking at people like Nimrod, you got Pharaoh, Sennacherib, Nebuchadnezzar, Darius, the Caesars, any real dictator that has come along in all the years, we know that millions of good people have been oppressed or hurt in one way or another by these rulers. Lots of people have suffered, and Solomon himself has even been guilty of putting his own people under a heavy yoke of bondage. We read about that in 1 Kings chapter 4. And keeping in mind that the Eastern rulers of that time and age, that day, they held the power of life and death. They decided that someone needed to die, they could snap their fingers, and it would happen. I mean, that's ultimate power over all the people there. They weren't elected. They weren't answerable to anybody. Some leaders did rule, I guess, in a benevolent way, but most of them were more tyrannical in their rule. But Solomon here, he describes, you could say an officer, maybe it's a royal court official of some kind. It's a man who had to carry out orders of some ruler or king, and this officer had wisdom, and it shows on his face. We read about that there in verse 1 and so forth. But suppose, though, that the king here commands the servant to do something evil, something that maybe this servant didn't want to do. What should the servant do? And so here is the wisdom that comes to his aid. And his wisdom told him that there were 4 possible approaches to this. And the very first possible approach that he may have had when he heard that the king told him to do something he knew would be evil or be wrong, the first possible thing would be what? What would come to your mind? If a king told you, I want you to go take this money from this group of people, but there was no tax, there was no law, you knew it was the wrong choice, what would you do? Would you disobey?
Not for long.
Not for long. That's right. Disobedience would come up. But as Solomon says here in verse 2, I say, he tells him, keep the command of the king because of the oath before God. So why? Well, the officer has to be true to his oath of allegiance to the king and to God. And who is the source of all authority in the world? Romans 13. That's the Lord. To disobey the orders would mean breaking that promise to God. Second, the king's word would have more power than the word of a servant, and was bound to prevail. Even if the king had to eliminate the opposition, nobody could safely question the ruler's decision. The king can do no wrong, they sometimes say. So there was no law that could find the king guilty. Third, the officer should obey orders so that he might avoid punishment. We read about that in the beginning of verse 5. He who keeps a royal command experiences no trouble. After all, his disobedience would just simply lead to his death. Paul used a similar argument in Romans chapter 13, verses 3 and 4. We all have enough misery. Why add to it? And one thing is sure, a day is coming when wickedness will be judged. When we get down to verse 8, into verse 8, there is no discharge in the time of war, and evil will not deliver those who practice it. Whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. And be sure, in number 32, be sure your sin will find you out. But suppose the servant simply cannot obey the master. Let's say it is to go kill somebody, but that would be, in his mind, that would be murdering the master. He cannot do it. Then what? Well, in verse 3 he says, do not be in a hurry to leave him. Do not join in an evil manner, for he will do whatever he pleases. But at that beginning, that desertion idea, do not be in a hurry to leave him. You can just see this officer leaving the king's presence, right? Maybe he's just say, you know what, I'm just going to leave. But then what? Will the king come after him? The king might be offended, might punish him. But more than one person has quit their job or resigned from office in order to keep their integrity. Or maybe there's defiance, as we read there in the last half of verse 3. Do not join in an evil manner. Can mean don't promote the king's evil plan, or don't get involved in a plan to overthrow the king. I prefer that being that second interpretation because it goes right along with that first admonition there in verse 3. So the officer rushes from the king's presence, finds others who are opposed to the king's plan, and then they maybe begin to plot against the king. Solomon did not approve that kind of approach. Now, is there ever a place for civil disobedience in the life of a Christian? Is there ever a place for that? Do law-abiding citizens have the right to resist authority? Thomas Jefferson once wrote, resistance to tyrants is obedience to God. Was he right in saying that? When it comes to matters of conscience and matters of the law, devoted believers, Christians, we have pretty much all agreed with what Peter had to say in Acts 5:29 when he said to the Sanhedrin Council, we ought to obey God rather than who? Man. Christian prisoners and martyrs down through the ages testify to the courage and the conscience of the importance of standing up for what is right. It does not mean we can resist the law in every minor matter that may disturb us, but it does mean we have the obligation to obey our conscience. How we express our disagreement with the authorities demands wisdom, though, and grace. And this is where the fourth possibility comes in. Look at the last half of verse 5 and verse 6. For a wise heart knows the proper time and procedure. For there is a proper time and procedure for every delight, though a man's trouble is heavy upon him. So you got this, we're back to this wise servant understands what time and what procedure must be considered in everything they do, because it takes discernment to know what the right thing is to do in the right time. That impulsive attitude that overreacts and storms into action, probably only going to make the problem worse for themselves. Wisdom helps us understand people and situations and to figure out the right thing to do at the right time. The wise heart will know the proper time and procedure. And again, I know we bring this up a lot, but I think sometimes we forget how serious of a situation. Remember when Saul went into the cave to relieve himself? David is there. He's being chased by him for so long. He knows that Saul is out to kill him. They're hiding in the cave. You know their adrenaline's got to be going up when they see them entering the cave. And there's the opportunity, and all the men are behind David to tell him, get him. This is your chance. And so here's an opportunity that's going to escape you in just a moment. You have to make a decision right then and there. You can see that he was relying on the proper wisdom and grace, the proper time and procedure. He wasn't just rushing into it, but he gave it thought before he did. Remember he cut the edge of his robe. How did he feel about doing that after the fact? Yeah, he felt guilty just for doing that because he recognized who's really ultimately in control. The wise heart will know the proper time and procedure. Who else throughout the Bible has known the proper time and proper procedure despite all the difficulties and hardships that were upon them? Did Joseph? Did Nehemiah? What about Daniel? I mean, many times in the book of Daniel where we see him recognizing and seeing that, and even the apostles and all that they could do, exercise spiritual discernment when they were arrested, when they were persecuted in Acts 4 and 5. They showed respect toward the authority, even though the religious leaders were prejudiced and acted incorrectly and wrong. The apostles were even willing to suffer for their faith, and the Lord honored them. We have, what's that? The three Hebrew boys. Okay, the friends of Daniel, and also in Daniel, all same thing. They were prudent. They had understood the time and what was happening. But we do have options. We have options of disobeying. We have options of running away or defying orders, even fighting back. But before we act, we must always exercise wisdom. We must always seek discernment, having understanding of the right time, the right procedure. And it's not easy to be consistent Christians in this complicated, evil times. It is difficult. But I know there are times where my first thought is, you know what, we ought to just do what whichever founding father said, that a good revolution might be good for the country. Who said that? Or something of that nature? You don't know? I think it was Jefferson also. But should we? And when should that be the actions we make? And when people do start deciding to do that, is that wise? Is that the right procedure? What should we do, especially us Christian? What attitude, what examples do we find in our New Testaments? We would always be careful with our emotions, hold back, pray, and then think about the examples given to us. Nehemiah is a great example of that. He was really wanting to help out his fellow brothers and sisters out over in Jerusalem. And I'm sure he had it in his mind of what he wanted to say to the king, but he had to wait for the right time, maybe the right procedure. And when the king saw the downcast of his face and he asked him what was wrong, what was the first thing he did? Prayed. And then he brought forth probably that thought that he's been working on for all that time, that he wanted to bring to the king, but he had to wait the right time to do things the right way. And when he did it, it worked out. God honored him and blessed him in those efforts. And Solomon goes on throughout this chapter talking about these attitudes that we ought to have in face of a difficult, hard time. This is a good chapter for us to take a look at these times. And the following chapters as well, as we're going through difficult times, not only in our country, but throughout the world, how we as Christians ought to respond.